exceedingly sorry to be late, which I am by rather an amount this morning. Simply got caught up at the slide library, and I can't go more than a certain speed. Would people who have empty seats next to them hold up their hands so that people can... Yes. Would you please? Might as well make the most of it. Keep the hands up. There's yours. Good. Good, that's better. Now then. Fine, thanks very much. Oops. The first thing is that we have brought, and no doubt Rose has already told you, we brought the poetry. And I may say that the poetry was far and away the best exercise, and there were some absolutely superb things. Most of them, and it's quite interesting, have already been collected. They were worth collecting, unlike some of the other papers. Now, you know exactly what happens for the rest of the quarter. You would do well, I think, to attend lectures from now on, because I shall have the last material fresh in my mind, so I shall almost certainly use it in tests. Remember that the test is a test of your quick-wittedness and your morals, rather than a very serious affair. There will be a prize, and that prize will be one of my paintings. So it is worth the while of some of you to work really hard. I don't know it's worth the while of all of you to work very hard on that account, because there is only one painting, and some of you may have fallen a little bit far behind. The substantial paper must be in on the 7th, and handsome means written in an excellent style. It doesn't simply mean done on a good typewriter. The test is compulsory. One or two people have come to me with reasonable, if not monumentally impressive, excuses for not taking the test. And I do, in fact, have an alternative which is reasonably dire and reasonably testing. But unless you have a good excuse, you take the test. Okay, are there any administrative questions? No. Well, there's one other administrative statement, and it's a slightly complicated one, and may take me about 3 minutes. It'll also help me to get my breath, so that when I start lecturing, I really know what I'm doing. And it is that you are fully entitled to evaluate me. I'm going to tell you the reasons why you should not attempt to do so. The first reason is that, and it's a very obvious one, that if you really knew the material of the course, what the devil are you doing taking it? You should be teaching it. And unless you know it really very well, you really can have very little idea of my accuracy. And that is possibly rather more important than my charm or the volume of my voice, though I do know that some professors don't make themselves heard at all. That's the first reason. The second reason is I hope you won't realize quite what the course has done to you for some time. It may well be when you're suddenly in front of a painting in the Jeu de Paume. In 10 years' time, you'll say, oh, God, he was right. But on the other hand, what a stuffy old thing. You're not ready to do it. The third thing is that I think the whole process is offensive both to you and to me. It's offensive to you because it takes you out of your proper place, which is being a student, and makes you into a connoisseur of professors. And I do not think not a bachelor of connoisseurship in professors is a suitable degree for a young person to attain. It actually poisons our relationship because you're writing about me instead of writing to me. And I never read any of the evaluations which are written about me, and I believe there have been 4 in the last 3 years. On the other hand, I have to point out to you that you're entitled to write what you like about me, within, of course, the laws of libel, to whomever you like, whenever you like. And you could easily write to your parents saying, UCSC is just absolutely awful because there's this silly old gaffer who gets in the way. You could write to your old schoolmistress or schoolmaster and say, I know where you got those absolutely deplorable teaching tricks from now. Or you could write to Chancellor Zinsheimer and say, you know, there should be a turnover in the campus. Everybody out, but Rose out first. Or whatever you like. I mean, it is your prerogative, your right. If you think there's something wrong with the course, the sensible thing is to come and tell me. Or write a letter to me, a polite and affectionate, admonitory letter, you know, in which you say, my very dear Professor Rose, if only you could control your saliva just a bit more. Or, honored sir, you speak too fast. Or even, say, bud, why don't you become an American? But I hope you understand what I'm getting at. I'm simply getting at the whole notion that writing poison pen letters is a bad idea. Now, not very long ago, a senior administrator on this campus sent round a missive of such appallingness, I tremble when I think about it. Because what it said was that professors should not encourage students to sign their names to the evaluation that they were writing, and that board chair should definitely deprecate, i.e. that the administration thinks, first of all, that students should be anonymous. Well, that's no news to you. But secondly, and this is what is so clear from this admonition, that professors are not to be trusted. Well, if professors are not to be trusted, why employ them? Either we are trustworthy, in which case a letter which says, you're a pretty rotten teacher, signed, you know, whatever it is something that one can take, relatively speaking, in one's stride. At least, you know, one wouldn't say, and you're a pretty rotten student, unless one thought it was true, which, of course, it could be. So I think you would do well, not only in this class, but in other classes, to ponder upon the whole issue of evaluation. And one of the things that I've said to you, I think, once, and I will say just once again, and that is that I think it goes on far too frequently and in far too feeble a manner. The first thing is that you know a great deal of how you perform. What you want, of course, is for somebody to say that you performed rather better than you have. You long, we all long, for people to give us just that little bit more praise than one deserves. And it's a perfectly natural longing, but you should conquer it. One of the things that you should learn when you arrive to university is how to be, indeed, appropriately self-critical. And there are two young men in this class who were sufficiently self-critical to, without collecting their old papers, to realize that those old papers were not good enough and to write afresh on an entirely voluntary basis. Well, that capacity for self-criticism is wonderful, and it is what will make you into serious and worthwhile people. So that you do not need all this evaluation. Least of all, you need it all the time on paper. It is much better if you come up and say, oh, what do you think? And then I'm able to say, and I see that you look terribly depressed. And so I say, pretty good. Whereas if you come bouncing and say, what do you think? Ha, ha, ha. I say, well, not one of your best, old boy. You know, criticism is such a difficult art, and one has to practice it with so much tenderness. And there are so many artists who, you know, long to be great painters or great sculptors and can't be, and you have to let them down lightly. And so I think that we can we should all exercise a little restraint and a little charity. I'm not suggesting that you should exercise any charity as far as I'm concerned, because the last thing that I have to tell you is that I'm a very old dog at this stage, and I can't learn any new tricks. So it's no good you're criticizing me very much. I mean, I'm going to teach in exactly the same way. And there's one other thing which is a very good proverb, and that is, don't try to teach your grandmother to suck eggs. And so we're ready to talk about more important things. Get the screen down, would you? Because what I wanted to do today was really to start talking about photography, but then I had an absolutely marvelous idea, at least I thought it was a wonderful idea. The music was deliberately intended to make you feel that there are different musical techniques, just as photography is a new and different technique. Also, of course, it is one which takes a long time really to suck the full juice out of. But I then thought that the greatest photographer in the world, and many, many other very great photographers in the world, are interestingly not men, but women. And I wanted you to ponder that. And then I thought, I have said so little about women artists that I ought to start my lecture, for a change, with ladies and leave the gents out for a bit. So, gents, you can come stiffly to attention and start feeling envious and longing, because we want to talk about women and the arts for a bit. And, of course, it's a fascinating and strange story. Could we have the lights down? Really down, because this image won't show up very well. And I start with a very fascinating image, and it is one that should be not unfamiliar to you. You can see what is going on. It is the life class at the Royal Academy shortly after the Royal Academy was founded. And when, of course, academies were founded in the 18th century, one of their chief intentions was to teach. And what did they teach? They taught the human frame divine. And that immediately, of course, produced a difficulty. If you look at this little slide carefully, you will identify the sex of the model, masculine. You will identify Sir Joshua Reynolds, masculine if only barely masculine. You will identify man, 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 man. Not even a Hugh person. Men. Now, is that the whole of the story? Not entirely. Let's have a next slide, please. It's very interesting. Here we have two portraits, the only two painted portraits in the room, and what is the sex of those portraits? They are ladies, and their names and their honorable names are Mary Mosa, and I think this is Mary Mosa, and this is Angelica Kauffmann. Why are they on the walls? Because they are, along with the men, founder members of the Royal Academy, but on the other hand, it is a male life class. And that problem, which is a problem in the 18th century, deepens as a problem in the 19th century. In the 18th century, it was still possible, I think, and certainly Angelica Kauffmann does it, for a woman to paint a male nude. I beg your pardon. I knew that it was a subject which would create a certain excitability. In the 19th century, it becomes even more difficult. And there's finally a very famous poem by Samuel Butler, which has a refrain, "Oh God, oh Montreal," because Samuel Butler goes to Montreal and he discovers a plaster cast of the Discobolus, which is put away because nobody dare look at it because it does not have adequate fig leaves on. So that you can see that there are some special problems attendant from the start of our period as far as the way that society will look at women as well as men painting. And it is curious because certainly in the 18th century there are several excellent women painters who become well known and indeed very highly thought of. And evidence there, Mary Mosa, Angelica Kauffmann. Mary Mosa, interesting enough, is the daughter of a painter, an engraver, and is rather better than her father. But let's have a look at some of these ladies really quite rapidly. And this is Margarete Giraud, and again, she's a French painter, and it's interesting because you see, I think she is the sister-in-law of Fragonard. It's in the family, and part of the problem is how do you, if you're a young woman, how do you learn unless it is in the family? And it is very difficult to learn outside the family. It is not easy to learn in an academy for many, many complicated reasons. One of the reasons, I think, is that in the academy, manners amongst the young tend to be rough. And that is true in the 18th, in the 19th, and indeed in the 20th century. And ladylike young ladies might find it rather difficult. Secondly, of course, there's a whole issue of what kind of art do you learn. And it will not surprise you to know that throughout the period we're talking of, and it links up with photography in a very interesting way, the center of feminine activity in painting is in the field of miniature painting. And the reason I think for this is it's much cleaner than oil painting on a large scale. It is supposedly less physically demanding, and it can probably be taught much more quietly and much more privately than large allegories. Anyhow, here's Margarete Giraud, and you would simply have to say that this is quite as good a painting in its own way as Fragonard's paintings. It is interesting if we turn for a moment to the issue of subject matter. That whole problem, which some of you may wish to address in papers, is there such a thing as a feminine subject matter as distinct from a masculine subject matter? And there are a whole group of scholars who would say, yes, of course. You only have to look at Mary Cassatt and her fixation on mothers and children. But then you only have to look at Giovanni Bellini and look at his fixation on mothers and children. Or Sir Joshua Reynolds. You only have to remember the Madonna and Child and recognize that men throughout the whole of history have been fixated on mother and child. So that when Mary Cassatt paints it, she's only painting what anybody else might easily paint anyhow. I think it's very, very difficult. There are women painters, I'm going to show you one, who are deeply interested in the military. There are rather a larger number of women painters than perhaps you might suppose who are interested in still life. And I think that there is a straightforward social reason for that. It is very cheap to go out and buy some potatoes or some pears and some apples. And many, of course, women were not making enormous sums of money, and probably financial issues are peculiarly important to them. Also, pears and apples cannot be criticized as being ungenteel. And in the 19th century, that is extremely important. You may say, well, this Margarete Giraud is somewhat sentimental. A mummy teaching her child to walk, and such a dear little chap, too. But I pointed out to you that Greuze is just as sentimental. So we can look at Margarete Giraud. Or we can indeed look at Angelica Kauffmann. Now, Angelica Kauffmann, I think, is a talent on a different scale. And I would like to talk to you about her at considerable length, but I won't. Partly because I don't really know enough about her. Scholarship has expanded on her enormously. She's obviously of German origins. She goes to Rome, she comes to England, and then she moves back to Germany. She is a very interesting example of an international female talent, and a very considerable one. Part of her time is spent on decorating ceilings, but that is not any more a feminine thing than it is a masculine thing, rather the reverse. And it is interesting to find a woman painter in the 18th century who is involved on large decorative commissions. She chiefly paints the medallions, and she gets involved, I think, a little bit with the brothers Adam in their rather elaborate and complicated ceilings. Here she is in a very interesting light as a portrait painter. And it will not surprise you to know that as well as still life and miniatures, women excelled a good deal at portrait painting. And again, I think you can see some of the reasons why. One of them, quite obviously, is a sense of social talent, a sense of discrimination of character. What are the other remarkable arts that women perform in the 18th and early 19th century? Well, the most obvious is novel writing. And if you like to take the 19th century, you could easily argue that women novelists far outdistance men novelists in the acuity and skill and sharpness of their psychological observation. So it might well go with that. The psychological observation in literature would accompany psychological observation as a portraitist. And Angelica Kauffmann is here portraying an extremely interesting person, the great art critic and historian Winkelmann, who, interestingly enough, was in fact a homosexual and an extraordinarily important figure in the move towards neoclassicism, and a romantic life because he's murdered in the improbable town of Trieste in 1768. So you might write an interesting paper on Kauffmann and Winkelmann. And Kauffmann becomes a major neoclassical artist, as well as a portraitist. And we can see her doing portraits, and it's a cute portrait. We can see her doing a self-portrait. And then we can see her working in the same kind of way as Benjamin West in neoclassicism, the same kind of way as Vienne, and looking very much forward to the world of J.L. David. And it is surprising, she has a very considerable grasp over some of the more difficult issues. A grasp of foreshortening, a grasp of the detailed articulation of limbs. She can do an ankle quite well. She can do some toes quite well. Now, some of you may say, well, how intolerably patronizing that is to say this. Why shouldn't she be able to do it? And the reasons have nothing to do with her personal abilities. They have to do with the difficulties of receiving a training that was thoroughly adequate. And obviously a very large number of women who painted did so entirely at the amateur level. And I'm going to show you a fascinating amateur in due course. But there's something thoroughly professional about Angelica Kauffmann, and the weaknesses that you may detect in her painting. Isn't it interesting to see the young men leaving the room? The weaknesses are weaknesses that you could see in many a man's painting of the period. The architecture doesn't really work exceedingly well over here. And the color is somewhat dingy. Another man goes out. Perhaps we'd be left entirely with ladies. Certainly we're not left with gentlemen, if they leave in that kind of way. So we can talk about Angelica Kauffmann. Another very interesting late 18th century figure is Anne Vallayer Costa, another French artist. And she was a great exponent of portraiture and also of still life. And here is an absolutely brilliant and creamy still life. And you feel at this moment something which I think is extremely important, and that is that the technical resources which she brings to it are in fact fine, remarkable. But I would emphasize again the general problem which you want to think about of gaining a technical education. And eventually, of course, women are allowed into this kind of academy and that kind of academy. By the end of the 19th century, there allowed into almost all the academies, and the rules under which they come into them become less and less humiliating. But if you want to read a very fascinating account, you could read Lady Butler's autobiography, in which she reproduces her diary of the 1860s, and she decides that she's going to exhibit at the Royal Academy, and she then, you see, gets into Hattersley's, and finally she exhibits in the Royal Academy. And one of the things that tells you, and you might want to read a history of the Royal Academy because it will tell you again in detail, that is that in the 18th century there's more freedom for women than in the middle, early to the middle part of the 19th century. Well, anyhow, you can see how rich, and of course that's a tradition which goes back to Rachel Rouiche and Louise Millon and a great many 17th century women still life artists. And then we come to a figure yet more remarkable and interesting, and that is Madame Vigée LeBrun, who not only painted the Marie Antoinette, the French royal family, but because of her conservative or her royalist connections, went on her travels in the 1790s, and like Angelica Kauffmann became a European figure. But perhaps more interesting in some ways than Angelica Kauffmann because she wrote some memoirs. And those of you who are really interested ought to have a look at those memoirs because they give you a first-hand light on what it was like to be a woman painter. And here you can see she is fully adept. It's a remarkable and lovely painting. Fresh. In fact, I think it's a pastel. Fresh, vigorous, full of mischief in the hair, with a very accomplished contrapposto, with complex lighting, and with a kind of sprightliness and eagerness and pleasure in the actual act of painting, which perhaps is the other side of the coin. Women had to be a good deal more dedicated in order to take up the art. Women also, I think, had to love it in its details rather more because they had a greater technical struggle. And I think this remains true to the present day, that women painters very often bring to painting, sculpture, photography, a kind of zest and a lack of conventionality which increases during our period and becomes enormously refreshing. It's partly, I think, because most women, fortunately, are not obsessed by public glory. They don't want to get knighthoods. Eventually, there's a very famous English woman painter who became Dame Laura Knight. But she's better than a dame. She's Laura Knight, besotted by painting, besotted by the theatre. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference. Anyhow, Vigée LeBrun, we can see a bit more Vigée LeBrun. Here she is painting her friend, Hubert Robert. And she shows, I think, that she was fully accepted into the painting fraternity. And she gives him, again, a wonderful, easy vigor. She enjoys his flesh. She enjoys his neckerchief. She enjoys his sheer physical and spiritual vigor. So she's a force to be reckoned with. And here she is herself. And I think, again, it's interesting. She's very determined to tell you in this self-portrait that she is indeed a painter. And that she's a painter who will wear wonderful costume and paint at the same time. And she's also, I think, very inclined to tell you something else, which is awfully worthwhile. And that is, you don't have to be, if you're a woman, a misshapen or miserable creature in order to be a great painter. You can be a substantial beauty as well. And when I was a young man, there was the thought going round that any woman who was intellectual had to be hideous. It wasn't borne out by any of the intelligent women I knew, but it was around. And I suspect it's around to some extent still. And it is, of course, true that very beautiful women, like very beautiful men, are sometimes superbly self-satisfied with their beauty and do nothing else. But it is true of men, indeed it's probably truer of men. You know those handsome men who prank and prince and prance up and down, you know, and say, look at me, I'm the handsomest thing that God ever made. And in fact, I don't think God made me. I made him, I'm so handsome. And there are young lasses who are a little bit like that. But Vigée LeBrun doesn't mind, and she doesn't mind. She's ready to confront everybody, and she's ready to do some very interesting things with shadow here. And she's ready to wear an absolutely wonderful bravura hat. Well, I don't want to follow, let's have a look next. I don't want to follow the history down too much, but I thought you'd be interested by this, because this is by Ellen Sharples. And the Sharples family, and this is really interesting, they must have been a very charming family, because everybody in the family painted. And that actually was true of Sir Joshua Reynolds' family. His nieces painted. And I want to insist upon this issue of a family affair, because painters on the whole tend to be much less prejudiced than the public, and I think always have been. And many, many a woman painter has painted in the family, and it's gone comparatively unknown. But the Sharples were a particularly interesting family because they practiced both in America and in England. And here is Ellen Sharples, as you can see, painting in a rather old-fashioned way for the late 18th century, an American Indian. Let's have a look at the next. And then here is her daughter with her, and this is Rolinda. And round Rolinda are all the fruits of the whole family. There was James Sharples too, James, Ellen, and Rolinda Sharples, and they ended up at Bristol, and they taught, and they painted, and you can see her with her marl stick, and you can see how the marl stick is used. You can see her with a very refined small brush, and Rolinda is, I think, probably the best of the painters. And there are some lovely still lives by her. So you see a family. I'm now going to introduce you to another family. There's another Rolinda, a very charming painting. You may say, well, perhaps this is feminine subject matter because it's so domestic. It's a cup of tea, a nice old Gamma Gurtons, and there's a little cat with a little mouse, with a little bird, and so on and so forth. But I could show you David Wilkie's, which are very, very close to that. And Rolinda had considerable success. I've forgotten which Sharples it was, did a very famous portrait, by the way, of George Washington. But as Americans, you ought to take a special interest in American art, particularly American women art. And I'm now going to introduce you to perhaps the most famous single family in the history of American painting, the Peels. And Daddy Peel was Charles Wilson Peel, and he loved painting so much that he called all his male children names like Raphael, Rembrandt, and Rubens. And this painting is, I think, of Rembrandt Peel, and it is by Rubens Peel. And then there was Titian Peel, and this is a drawing by Titian Peel. And then this is Raphael Peel, a very famous painting, one of the most extraordinary and beautiful paintings in the whole of the history of American art. But we can't stay because Charles Wilson Peel had a daughter. And because I think the art history was inadequate, he didn't call her Kauffman Peel, or Rouge Peel, or Leicester Peel, or Gentileschi Peel, or even Artemisia Peel. He merely called her Sarah Miriam Peel, but she painted. And there is one of her paintings. Finally, I thought it would be interesting for you to, well, no, I've forgotten. I'm going to talk about two more, very quickly, women artists, because I know that some of you will want the names in order to be able to write papers. And perhaps the most interesting woman painter of the whole of the 19th century was Rosa Bonheur. I don't think she was necessarily the best, because as an animalier, I think she lacks, for instance, the austere dignity of George Stubbs. On the other hand, some of you who want to do it might well want to write a paper comparing her with an English animalier painter, Sir Edwin Landseer. And horse for horse, dog for dog, Rosa Bonheur beats him out of the field. She became a friend of Queen Victoria, and it is interesting you see that Queen Victoria actually did some etchings and some watercolors. And there's a little publication of Queen Victoria's watercolors in her journal. They are poor stuff. But then Queen Victoria had other things to do. And in fact, as you can see, Rosa Bonheur responds in a very interesting way to Buffalo Bill. She responds splendidly to a horse scene front view. And that is, as you know, not the easiest position in which to do a horse. This was done towards the end of her life. Rosa Bonheur, dressed very much like a man and had a female companion and was obviously in some ways a tough, gruff kind of lady. She may have been a little bit like one of my oldest friends, who was also a very brilliant woman artist, in whose house I met my wife, and to whom I'm always therefore extremely grateful. But she was also a wonderfully good painter. And here is Rosa Bonheur doing her own favorite dog. And as you can see, there's absolutely no technical hesitation whatsoever. She's an extremely accomplished artist, and she has a very, very deep feeling for animals, and she can actually compose a very large painting on a very considerable scale. And that's not an easy kind of painting to paint. It's quite an exciting kind of painting to paint. One of the things, however, that you might ask yourself is, will you expect women painters, on the whole, in the 19th century, to be in the forefront, not of technical aspects, but of ideological aspects? It is awfully difficult, I think, in that period. George Eliot, yes, is ideologically extremely progressive. She starts off by doing a translation of Strauss's Life of Jesus, which is really a desperately heretical book for the 1840s. And there are a few women who are ready to brave every kind of social sneer in the period. But particularly if you want, you see, it's very difficult for painters, partly because a painter is more socially glued. A writer doesn't have to meet his public all the time. A painter tends to have to. A writer, and as you know, well, after all, take George Eliot. She wrote under a pen name, and it wasn't a feminine pen name. And her first book, which had tremendous success, you see, everybody thought it was a man except for Charles Dickens, who said, I detect a woman's voice in this book. But meeting your clients, meeting your patrons, and meeting your confrères in a rather special kind of way, it's more difficult. And the tradition is not so well established as the writing tradition. And you can think about it in this kind of way, that it is much easier for women to break through in writing than it is in painting, just as it's much easier for them to break through in painting than it is in the art of conducting an orchestra, where it is extremely difficult for women to break through, partly because of that appalling thing which obviously pained women for a long time, which is the question of what you wear as a conductor. And orchestras are regimented to such an extent that it's much, much more difficult. So you have to bear those kind of considerations in mind when you consider Rosa Bonheur, or when you consider my own favorite, partly because I have a streak of absolute perversity in me, which is Lady Butler. And Lady Butler was born Elizabeth Thompson, and her sister was born Alice Thompson, and Lady Butler became this great painter, and Alice married a man called Mennell and became an extremely well-known poet. So that they were an extremely gifted family, and it's important their father and mother were very enlightened and sweet people. And Lady Butler, as a young woman, was taken traveling all over Europe, and she was encouraged by her parents. She was even encouraged when she no longer cared simply to be an amateur, but to become a professional. And she became an extraordinary person because she married a military man and then devoted herself to these extremely popular and complex military paintings. Now, one of the things that she had to do And it was really difficult for her. She had to go and talk to all sorts of military men and get them to lend her uniforms and get them to tell her about the Crimean War and get them to pose for her. She's absolutely dauntless in this. And here's another one. We don't in the library have her most spectacular one, which shows a charge. And it is most interesting in that charge. Elizabeth Butler does things with horses which are, in fact, extremely rare at the time. My final lady, and I have a block about her name. She's American, and I'm sorry, her name has gone straight out of my mind. It always goes straight out. It's one of my favorite paintings of the 19th century. It's about Marcus Quintus Rufus, who, you remember, leapt into Marcus Curtius Rufus, leapt into the crevasse which opened in Rome. He's a part of early history of Rome. And you can see that this woman was not a very tutored artist. She's a naive painter. She's a middle of the 19th century American naive painter, but she's absolutely marvelous, isn't she? Let's have a look at the next two, which show you the details. And isn't that a wonderful painting? She is, of course, the ancestor of Grandma Moses, amongst other things. But it is so full of vivacity, it's so full of social enjoyment, it's so full of heroic enjoyment, it's so untrammeled. And I think what you have to think of is enormous numbers of women painting in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century very like this. And of course, most of those paintings are still in attics, if they still exist at all, because the training wasn't available. The talent was there, but the society felt otherwise. And so much of the talent went into embroidery. Not that embroidery is anything but wonderful. Much of the talent went into quilting. Not that quilting is anything. Much of the talent went into making wonderful meals. Not that wonderful meals are nothing. And some of the talent was simply spat upon. Of that you can also be sure. And you can be sure that it is spat upon to this day in some circles, because talent is often spat upon, whether it's masculine or feminine in gender. But the greatest of all 19th century women artists, and in some ways I think the greatest woman artist to date, is not surprisingly a photographer. Let's have a look at the next. And her name is Julia Margaret Cameron. And she was one of the famous Pattle sisters. And she was dearly beloved by Virginia Woolf, who never knew her, but who, with Roger Fry, wrote a little book about her photographs, and even more interestingly, wrote a play about Julia Margaret Cameron, which is called Freshwater, which was first performed, I think, at Stanford in the 1960s, and which I would heartily recommend to any of you who are interested in Virginia Woolf, interested in photography, or interested in anything that's worth being interested in. It's a very funny, lively, and agreeable play. Marvelously good. And why may it be that Julia Margaret Cameron can do things that, with every wish that one can have in one's heart, is much more difficult even for Angelica Kauffman, or for Margarete Giraud, or even for Lady Butler or Rosa Bonheur. And I think that the thing is that Julia Margaret Cameron is in on the beginning of a new birth, a new technique, a new way of seeing. And the whole thing has not been pulled in a masculine direction so far that it's difficult for her to contribute. It goes even deeper. There is not the same kind of problem about her doing it, though it is fascinating to read in the descriptions of her. You see, when she started taking it up in the 1850s, it was still a very new art, because, as you all know, photography starts in 1839 with the daguerreotype, and in 1840 with the calotype. So that she's in, relatively speaking, at the birth. But the memoirs tend to notice how dirty her fingers are. They notice how untidy she is. They notice how obsessed she is with her art. And there is a certain element of sneering in them, as though somebody who is obsessed with his or her art wouldn't be covered in the appropriate chemicals, wouldn't be somewhat uninterested in dusting, wouldn't be somewhat uninterested on occasions in whether her underwear was showing, or some such, wouldn't have her hair just a little bit untidy when she emerged from underneath, you know, those wonderful velvet objects which you put your head under when you're making a photograph of the period. She aims at the very highest kind of effects. And she is, of course, privileged because she and her sisters moved in the most interesting of Victorian society. She moved in the society of poets and painters and statesmen, and astronomers. And so here she is doing a superb photograph of Sir John Herschel. And who is Sir John Herschel? I think Sir John Herschel is a man who, didn't he discover Pluto? He's one of the greatest astronomers, one of the greatest telescope builders, and as you look at him, you can see that he's not simply an aurora borealis. He has a ring round his head like Saturn. His eyes gleam as though they can penetrate the very furthest recesses of the darkest holes in the most remote galaxies. It's a wonderful and extraordinary portrait. And what makes it even more interesting is, of course, that it is done at a time when painted portraiture is sinking. It is one of the most arresting images of the 19th century. And it is done by this extraordinary woman. And we'll return to her in a moment or two, but I want now to go on and do the next, please. And of course, you know, from the early photograph descends such an array of extraordinary events. And of course, one of the things one has to recognize is that photography is so closely linked with painting, and painting is so closely linked with photography. And of course, almost all painters have to take a stand of one kind about photography, and all photographers at one stage or another have to think about painting. So I thought I'd remind you of a rather more recent image, which is a fascinating one of such a complex kind. This is a photograph by Man Ray of Marcel Duchamp in drag. I can't this afternoon explore the whole history of photography, but work for work, this is very, very clever. But in terms of its seriousness of spirit, I doubt that it comes anywhere near Julia Margaret Cameron. And indeed, I doubt that any portrait photographer of the last century and a half comes very close to her. And it has something, I think, to do with another very special issue, which you have to think about, and that is when a technique is new, it offers such a perfume of excitement. And that as it's more and more exploited, the sense of its freshness decreases. There is a convention. Somebody else has done this aspect of it before. There is also something else which I think is extremely important, and that is that there is nothing left to struggle with of a technical kind. That is to say, simple technical issues, which are very fundamental in early photography. It's extraordinarily difficult to do at the very beginning, are gradually swept aside. And so you may say, well, of course, there's an enormous technique which nowadays is involved in photography, but that's not a technique which is involved with jamming the thing down, with getting something said. That is technique for its own sake. And in the history of art, you always move from a situation, it's ever recurrent, from a situation where the technical problems are subordinated to the issue of the message, to a situation in which the technical problems become the message. And of course, in the 20th century, all technical problems are now the only message that most people want to listen to. Thus, We are told when we go to a restaurant exactly how the food is cooked, mendaciously, of course. Manuals about lovemaking are so incessantly technical in their concern. Zen Buddhism gets mixed up with motorcycle maintenance. And I suspect that many a young photographer is barking up the wrong tree of development. Because we are, as they say, excessively process-oriented. But Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, of course, were funny. But for Julia Margaret Cameron, it was an issue of dear life. Well, of course, painters have been interested in photography. And in the 19th century, a whole array of painters actually take photographs. And they take them, I think, for many, many different reasons. Here's a photograph by Thomas Eakins, the great American realist from Philadelphia, who in the 1870s to about 1900 produced a most extraordinary series of extraordinarily important and great paintings, not, I think, even today, well enough understood or admired. And amongst them, he does a number of paintings of musicians. And he also does photographs of musicians. And then you can begin to see how certain photographs will help a painter in a certain very special and technical kind of way. One of the ways is because certain things are done really rather fast. And exactly how you hold a cello bow is something which is not always easy to understand with the naked eye. And so here we see a painting by Eakins of a violinist. I'm afraid I can't absolutely, with the resources in the slide library as at present, is match image for image. But you can see Eakins uses his camera as a way of extending the power and memory of his own eye. And that can become more and more inextricable. Let's have a look at another photographer, painter. Fascinatingly enough, it's Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who does many photographs of his love, Jane Morris. And you can see that he is fascinated by her. He wants to pose her in pre-Raphaelite poses with wonderful costume and looking dire, romantic, and overwhelming, sometimes against a simple background, sometimes against a much more complicated background. Another photographer, painter, and one who will interest you, I think, more deeply, is Degas. And Degas actually doesn't take up photography in his early period. And indeed, he uses photography, not much actually, personally, his own photographs for paintings. He does them in the 1880s and 1890s when his attention is shifting considerably from photography actually towards sculpture. And he does it, I think, partly because he's fascinated by every possible different language. And you must remember that Degas is a sculptor as well as a painter. He's a pastelist and a draftsman as well as a painter. And he's a photographer, and his photographs have their own separate existence. They are not, I think, very great photographs, but they show something about his sheer curiosity. And any painter at some stage is simply going to be curious. By the way, this is Renoir, and this is Mallarmé. And we don't have a very good selection. Now, we have to remember, of course, that in any case, elements of photography go back so far. This painting, which was painted in the 1670s, probably late 1660s by Vermeer, was almost certainly painted with the aid of the camera ottica. That is to say, that use of a lens and a box in order to project an image. You just must remember that the difference really comes when photography fixes the image. The use of the camera, let's have a look at the next. The use of the camera ottica is very common in the 18th century. And there's absolutely no doubt that the great Italian Veduti painter, Canaletto, used it frequently because he had a problem of extreme accuracy. in making his renditions of views of Venice. And one of the things that gives it away is what you call the wide screen, or the wide lens, that your ordinary eye cannot actually take in quite such a territory all at once. So that we find that this optical aid, and it's only one of a number of optical aids, is deeply influencing 17th and 18th century artists. I'll tell you another optical aid, which is a very fascinating one. And it is called the Claude glass. And what it was a piece of glass which was slightly colored, a sort of browny color, and it was used by landscape artists who wanted to get the tones in the landscape to come closer together. So they got out their Claude glass, and then they looked at the landscape, and it looked ever so much more like a painting by Claude. And so they were very, very happy. And you can see then that once you start having the camera and you start having photography, your painters are going to look at landscape, they're going to look at still life, they're going to look at people with a fresh eye, and they're going to see something different. Their whole aesthetic basis is going to change. The issue is how fast, in what ways, and that, of course, is dependent upon a whole number of things. One of the fundamental differences, of course, is between two very different kinds of early photograph. Here is Niepce's famous 1826 protophoto, which I told you took about 10 hours to develop. You can see it's extremely fuzzy and extremely grainy. And one of the things which happens in the 19th century is that you get those photographs which are muzzy and blurred. And that actually is one of the things which I think helps to create one phase in Corot's painting. It also may be one of the things which leads into certain elements in Renoir's Impressionism, where you will notice that the forms are wonderfully softened. Basically, in the 1840s, you have these two great men, Louis Daguerre, the Frenchman, who cast the daguerreotype on the world in 1839 without any kind of patent, so that its use spread at astonishing speed. And the Englishman Fox Talbot, who in 1840 produced a thing called the Calotype. Now, the Calotype uses negatives and is printed upon paper. The daguerreotype is printed upon a metal plate and is therefore unique. The daguerreotype is much smaller than the Calotype. And the daguerreotype, provided people don't move, produces an image of astonishingly sharp focus, as you can actually see here. I want you to look at this photograph for a moment, because there it is. And we've seen one of the problems is the problem of the length of exposure, from 10 hours to 20 minutes to 1 minute to a millisecond. And that's a long technical development. Now, if you look at this street, something very fascinating you can see. It is empty, isn't it? Almost. The person here was the one person who was relatively still. He was having his shoes shined. So he was there long enough to be developed. There were probably other people walking in the street whose image disappears because they were moving too fast. And I do want you to think about that, because it has so many repercussions. One of the repercussions is it makes you realize something about the blurred focus of the Impressionists. It also makes you realize something else about Impressionism, that Impressionism can only develop out of a capacity to think that ultimately a single look of the eye is different from every other single look of the eye. It has a different relationship to the notion of movement. And Impressionism is a world which is concerned in a fresh way with movement. Now, painters have always been concerned with movement. If you take Uccello's battle scenes, they're concerned with movement. But if you take Géricault's horse, the derby at Epsom, he's concerned with movement. Eventually, of course, the great Anglo-American local person, Wiard Muybridge, and also Eakins, analyzes movement at really top speed. But the issue of movement and the issue of time enters into a totally fresh phase the moment you have photography, because you are suddenly saying it is this particular moment and absolutely no other moment whatsoever. Of course, one of the first things that the photographers did was to do still life. And this is another daguerreotype actually by Daguerre, and it's probably the best known of all his pieces. And as you can see, still life is admirably suited to the very beginnings of the camera, because it'll stay still for 15 to 20 minutes. And then you can get this marvelous sharpness of detail, and you will simply find that it is enjoyed for its own sake. It seems miraculous, and what it does, of course, it is at once the result of an appetite for naturalism and begets a further deep, deep development of naturalism. And the pre-Raphaelites, for instance, are absolutely inconceivable without photography. The association of pre-Raphaelites, Rossetti, for instance, the association of Impressionists, which you can do through Nadar, who made this photograph of Guizot, and in whose studio the first Impressionist exhibition takes place, really quite obvious. What, in fact, were photographs, well, particularly daguerreotypes, used for? And you see, the daguerreotype immortalizes Daguerre, but it doesn't actually say anything about photography being an art. The calotype, which is invented by Fox Talbot, has a Greek root, and the Greek root suggests beauty is involved. Kalos, you see. So that there's this whole issue, which has remained an issue to this present day, of whether photography really is an art. And at one stage you can say, well, there it is, the way in which it's done, there's a mechanical movement of the hand, it really is a mechanical rather than an artistic device. And on the side of that, it is perfectly clear that photography can be used for quite other purposes. And initially, quite a lot of its purposes were not primarily, in one sense, aesthetic. This is a portrait of Guizot. It is, in fact, I think, a brilliant portrait and catches an extremely grim and powerful person in an extraordinary kind of way. But is it an aesthetic object, or is it a record? This is Georges Sand, and we must be again tremendously grateful to Nadar for showing us what Georges Sand looked like. But is it a record, or is it a work of art? And I can't resist certain elements in the stripiness, and I can't resist the turn of the head. And of course, one of the things that is almost inevitable is that the early photographers were very often themselves initially painters. And Daguerre was a painter. The other side of it is Fox Talbot was an amateur scientist. And so you can see that there's this moving between science and art at the beginning of photography in an interesting kind of way. And the conventions are often those of contemporary portrait painters. I thought you'd be amused to see this early caricature, because it brings home to you one very simple thing, and that is that it was not a comfortable procedure having your photograph taken in the early history. This is the early 1850s. And as you can see, the head is held steady by a rather handsome clamp here. To secure a pleasing portrait is everything. Well, maybe. And it possibly sheds some light on the sense of grimness which you can see. Is it now time to go? Oh, it's just more men walking out. What is the time? Oh, well, we must go on. Show me the next slide and the next slide and the next slide quickly, please, because, well, you can see this is a painter. Why is she holding her hand to her chin? It's a new fashionable photographic pose by Ang. Let's have a look at next. He does that more than once. The new fashionable photographic pose, holding the head steady. And let's have a look at the next. And then, of course, fascinating, what happens to the photograph, and it can do something to portraiture, you see, which entirely shows, I mean, no portrait painter could get as close to Toulouse-Lautrec as that, because they'd be drowned in the alcoholic fumes. The close-up is a great invention of photography, and we seem to have closed up on time for you to go, but you must see some more. Let's have a look at some more. More Nadar, here is Liszt, and here is Dumas. Let's have a look at some more, just to look at them. Now, this is interesting because this is a photograph from one of the first great texts, scientific texts, and it is Charles Darwin's expression of the emotions in man and animals. And you see, Darwin uses photography for scientific exposition of different human emotions, which, of course, and then Eakins uses it in order to understand human movement. And there's an Eakins photograph. Of course, it could equally well be used for quite other purposes. Theatrical, and this is a character in a farce called Lord Dundreary. And so you can see that the photograph is taken over, of course, at a very early stage by journalism. It is also taken over by geographical exploration, quite obviously. Here is the first calotype, or pseudo-calotype, by Fox Talbot. Let's go on and have a look at the next, 1835. And here is something closer to a real calotype, a portrait of a leaf. And you can see that Fox Talbot is interested in it in a scientific way. And here is architecture, which, of course, is one of the great things. And then Fox Talbot at Laycock Abbey does this wonderful broom. And notice how rich and ripe and lovely the texture of the calotype becomes. And it is the calotype which Julia Margaret Cameron explores. Another Fox Talbot. Let's go on, because I do. Interestingly, of course, dirty pictures were also early part pornography, or pseudo-pornography was early part of the exploitation of the camera. But it is interesting how this nude relates so closely to Courbet, doesn't it? And how this Courbet then relates so closely to a nude which was done by Nadar about a year after that Courbet. Used for the background by W.P. Frith. Here is a photograph, I think, by Julia Margaret Cameron. No, maybe by, no, it is Julia Margaret Cameron, I think. And you can see the foliage and how that gets into the pre-Raphaelite Arthur Hughes. So that we can get to Julia Margaret Cameron. This is, let's go on, I don't even want to explain that. I want to get to Julia Margaret Cameron. And one of the things, of course, was that photographers wanted, some of them wanted to create great works of art. And here is Thomas Couture's Romans of the Decadence, and here is Reijlander, photo montage, Two Ways of Life. And you can see how closely related it is to the Couture. And at the same time, you can see that it was really a dead end for photography. That view of photography, that kind of high art photography, didn't really work very well. There's a detail of it. And technically, it was frightfully difficult to do, and it just is wonderfully absurd, isn't it? What was much more suitable was what Hill and Adamson did. They had to paint. Hill and Adamson, it's actually Hill, had to paint a painting with no less than 500 portraits in it. So he called upon Adamson, who was a chemist, to help him do the photography, and Hill and Adamson became a pair, and then they did the most marvelous photographs for this mass portrait. And here are some of the elders of the Scottish Kirk who were photographed to go into this huge portrait. They're wonderful things, and Hill and Adamson did the most marvelous, marvelous, dramatic, superb photos. Along with Cameron, I think they're the greatest. Wonderful Scottish sailors and Scottish fishwives, and then let's have a look at the next, Scottish soldiers, ladies with a bird cage. She's an extraordinary pair. Look at her, isn't she so wonderful? You can just hear her concise and superior little voice and telling everybody off. Julia Margaret Cameron, like Reislander, whom she knew, tried to do some narrative photos. And this is one in which I've forgotten who it is, but it's a noble Victorian gentleman. He's dressed up as King Arthur. And it doesn't work terribly well because the chainmail suit is so absurd. And here are the 5 wise virgins. And again, it's somewhat silly. But when Julia Margaret Cameron moves towards a Madonna, the intensity increases. And when she moves towards her portraits of great men, she is absolutely astonishing. What a pompous and wonderful silly ass this man is. And yet how sort of fascinating and charming, and how rapidly she catches him. And actually this is really, I think, probably the first close-up. And here is a marvelous portrait of Tennyson. That was Sir Henry Taylor. This is a marvelous portrait of Tennyson, who was a neighbor at Farringford in the Isle of Wight. And there you see that creaking, tobacco-tossed and stained, bilious and domed bard. And if you compare it with a painting, you see how Julia Margaret Cameron at once manages to tell the truth and yet give you a sense of an enormously poetic personality, whereas her friend, G.F. Watts, gives you the poetic personality without necessarily giving you the tobacco and the biliousness and the grumpiness and the flinging of the cape and the melancholy, the real melancholy, and the baggy, sad, myopic middle age of poor old Tennyson. So Julia Margaret Cameron is a character to reckon with. Thank you.